Welcome back, YouTube. Content as reward from Tim Cain. Let's jump in and see. And we still have some chat talking about the previous content, so we'll let them go.
Hi everyone, it's me, Tim.
Hi, Tim.
Today I want to talk about content as reward.
Yeah.
Now this is a really great topic. It was suggested by Ulysses Sampaio, who said, "A suggestion for a video, content as reward. This is a major overlooked thing in game dev, in my humble opinion, which I feel massively railroads player action." I agree. I can't believe I've never talked about this, and you're right. I never have.
Railroads.
So let me talk about what it is, why I like it, why you don't see it much, and a possible solution which you may not like.
I think it depends on scope, though. I mean, you could. I'm gonna get a bit semantical about this, but I think the semantics of what we define as content do matter. How, what are semantics of content and what are the semantics of reward? You could argue that an RPG game like Golden Chronicles that rewards the player with an extra encounter for a character if they go down a certain dialogue path is content as reward. Is that railroading the player, or is that just being able to respond to actions and have an in-game response that feels meaningful? So do we mean that, or do we mean more like what we're talking with decimation, which is completing a challenge and rewarding a new game mode? So I want to know, where exactly are we on this spectrum of what is a reward and what is content meaning in this case? So I kind of agree that in some cases it can railroad the player, but in other cases, it is just a general part of the game, right? Where if you piss off the Dark Brotherhood in Skyrim and you can't complete their quest line, well, that's more of a choice, right? And you're locking yourself out of that content. I don't know. I need it to be defined more. So let's see what Tim says about it. Prime example is No Man's Sky. People who can make their own fun are the ones that enjoy it most. Yeah. Players sets out goals and rewards. I don't know. It's just for me, it depends on genre, and it depends on how it's being handled.
So let me define what I think Ulysses meant by this and what I'm going to take it as meaning, which is if you make a game and you have content in that game that opens up and is available based on player agency, this is content as reward. Basically, it's content that is a direct consequence of player choice. The player did something, picked something about their player character, and now part of the game is opened up because of that.
Okay, so more like Pet Pal in Divinity, or Speak with Animals in Baldur's Gate. Though Baldur's Gate 3, I think it worked better because you can make potions. But I think he's meaning specifically like character creation he said here. So something like Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2, you could, I think, for sure 2, I'm not sure about 1, you could pick the Pet Pal trait so that you could speak with animals. And if you don't pick this trait, you can't speak with animals. So you're like, it's just kind of this thing that exists, and the player doesn't have any option to engage with this content unless they do something really, really simple. Cyberpunk 2077, if you deny a character, you lose a quest line. But I don't see a problem with that. Like, I think that in an RPG game, stuff like that is great. Roguelikes of content as reward, down pat. You unlock stuff as you play. I don't see it as railroading the player unless the player doesn't have other choices, right? Where it's like you either have this or don't have this, depending on your actions, but there's kind of no other choice but to say yes. I don't know. Maybe there's some better examples that you guys have. Elden Cockring, perfect example. Here's a new weapon that you can't use it, but go ahead and grind out 40 more levels, and now you can use it, rewarded content. That's kind of fair. I don't know, this to me, I don't necessarily agree with Tim. I think I sometimes agree with Tim that it railroads players, but it depends on how it's handled. sometimes limiting players' choices early on and unlocking content as they go is a good way to pace the game. So you aren't given all those crazy choices at the start of the game, right? You unlock new abilities, you unlock new weapon parts or something, and that way, once you understand the basics, we pace your unlock so that you are not overwhelmed at the start of the game. You know, there are good examples of doing that, and why that's a very good way to design progression, just to not prevent, to prevent the player from getting overwhelmed at the start of the game.
Now you see this a lot in things like, if you don't take lockpick, you can't pick locks. If you don't have a good dialogue skill, you can't pick a line in dialogue. But
Okay.
I think what I'm talking about here
Yeah.
is like major content. And I'll go in and talk about what I mean by that.
Okay, I can
But
agree with that.
it should be no doubt to anyone who's watched more than 2 videos on this channel that I love this. To me, anything that makes the game react to how the player is choosing to play your game is a good thing. I love it when the player goes off the beaten path and explores and finds content because of that.
Yeah.
Stuff they're not led to. There's no quest taking you there. There's no task. You just stumbled across a cave, and inside the cave is a bunch of cool stuff. I like skills that have unlocks or perks you can buy that require point allocation to get. It's not just, spend a point on it and then here's the stuff. You may have to buy it up, like it's a master level unlock on a skill, or it's a perk that requires, 2 other perks to get. And then it opens up content in the game.
Well, yeah, because it creates builds. But, in the cases like this, especially with games that Tim Cain has made, you have multiple solutions. So if you are playing a character that is brute force, break down doors, well, you're not going to pick lockpick, right? But maybe the game allows you to brute force break down doors with enough strength or something, right? So you have multiple ways of solving the problem. But I can agree that if something is just locking you out entirely because you don't have lockpick skill, that's annoying. There are games that I know like that. I don't think I can name any off the top of my head, but there's literally no other way to solve this problem unless you can lockpick. So this big house full of cool stuff to loot is not available to you because you didn't pick lockpick. And there's no other way through it. You can't use some agility skill to scale the roof and climb through a window. You can't break down the door with enough strength, even though that's going to make noise. You can't pickpocket the key from the NPC as they're roaming around and then break into their house that way. The alternative solutions don't railroad the player. Those are just different ways to solve the problem. But I can agree to an extent where if it's just you now don't have access to this big old house or any other houses in the city because you didn't pick lockpick, you decided to pick a dialogue heavy character, persuasion, bartering, intimidation, well, fuck you. Problem is that it's not a choice, an event that happens. It's not like I don't like your approach to the situation, and the NPC is like, okay, go fuck yourself, you lose a quest line. Yeah. That's why I like to do Deus Ex. Yeah, Deus Ex does it well. Hitman does it well. Cauldron Chronicles, I kind of want to be in a similar path with the NPCs where there are multiple ways to solve a problem, and sometimes there are ways that you can anticipate things that you don't anticipate. Obviously, it all revolves around you making potions, but that there are multiple ways to solve a problem sometimes. And even with some of the new things that we've implemented, there is now a way in the game to convince an NPC to, no, you don't want this potion, you want this potion. Achievement Hermit, never talk to an NPC, I just don't engage in the game.
That otherwise wouldn't be available.
Achievement, never launch the game, but the only way to get the achievement is to launch the game. Wait, then you can't get the achievement. So people will unlock it with Steam Achievement Manager. Solution.
Like having lots of different companions if you make a game where the player can pick up companions. And I like that those companions made either whether you can get them and what
they can augment.
how they play depends on the player's skills and the player's attributes and actions the player has taken. In fact, the original Outer Worlds design had more companions in it. But you couldn't get some companions based on what kind of character you were playing. Maybe your leadership skill wasn't high
Well,
enough.
that would have been cool.
Maybe you chose the board path
Outer Worlds 2,
before
maybe?
you ran into this companion and they were just like, I'm not joining you. Or if they were in the party already, they're like, I'm out of here. You chose the board, I'm gone.
Yeah, I like that. I think Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous does that a lot. Baldur's Gate kind of does. But I know Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, because it was so, it's based on Pathfinder system, and Pathfinder system places a lot of emphasis on the alignment, that a lot of characters would not join you in Wrath of the Righteous, or they would openly oppose you and say, no, I'm out of here, I'm done. If you had, if you did something that was just totally in stark contrast to their alignment. And I really like that. I think that basing like alignment, or just, let's say, value based conflict between characters is one of the coolest things you can have in any RPG, where you pick up this companion who has a different morality, view of the world than you, and you have to contend with that. Like, that challenges you, it challenges them. Maybe they'll change, maybe you'll change, maybe nobody changes, and you'll have a fight, or they'll just leave, or they'll try to attack you. I think that's great, and not having that kind of robs the game for me in a lot of ways, or games that don't have that issue with. I don't feel like these characters are real, because whatever they just stand for, whatever I stand for. They don't actually feel like real characters to me.
Now let me explain. So now that you understand what we're talking about and how much I love it, let me explain why you don't see this that much. Content as reward has a direct result, which is some players won't see some content in your game.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a lot of content. Like, just let me throw out an example.
Golden Chronicles
Let's
will have
say that 20% of your game is something that's reactive to one of three things the player can do. So maybe it's the main story and the player chooses side A or chooses side B or rejects both sides. And then there's content. And it's not a lot, it's like 20% of the game. Well, let's think about that for a second. So 80% of the game is the same, but then you have three different 20% contents. That means the total of your game is 80, 20, 20, 20, 140. You just made a game that's bigger than the original game by almost half.
Yep.
So instead of having to make a game, you have to make a game and a half.
That's why we talk a lot about, for Golden Chronicles, that we need to make sure that NPC storylines are most of the time maybe very contained, or at most they impact one other NPC, and we very, very carefully pick and choose the NPC storylines that will have a larger impact on maybe many NPCs, because it can really just spiral out of control. It can very, very easily spiral out of control. We need to do this in a smart way, right? And the good thing is, a lot of our content will be narrative based. So when something changes for an NPC, we just spawn a different encounter, and most of that's just narrative writing. It's just dialogue. So we don't actually have to like show a city that's been burned down by a dragon, right? We can just talk about it, and that saves us a lot of budget. But we still need to write it, and that will increase the budget, but it won't be as much as it could be. MMO games do this all the time. You don't go to this raid to get XYZ, you won't see that part of the world, never. Gatekeeping content is actually often used in games. That's pretty true. Yeah, like old school RuneScape has it a lot, where if you don't do the quests, that you are locked out of a lot of content. But you can't get locked out of quests. You can do all the quests in any order that you want. Let's just say you don't get locked out of quests. You will always be able to complete them, so everybody can unlock all the content, unless they just don't want to.
That's expensive. It's very expensive for you to make content that some players will never see. And keep in mind, that's just not system mechanics and the content they can unlock. It may be new maps, it may be NPCs, it may be monsters, it almost certainly will include voiceover. All of the stuff is money to make, money to test.
Yep.
and then it won't be used. And
Well, and some, eventually it's going to, if you're making, like, let's say 200% of your game and players are only expected to experience 100% of that in some order, right? You're having to make essentially twice as much content as the normal game would have, but also players might feel upset because they missed out on content. They might like these characters enough, but they don't feel like replaying it enough that they feel frustrated. So there is a balance to reach here, and certainly it is a risk. It's a risk, but I think one that I'm willing to take and see what players think of it. Locking out a quest or parts of a story game is not that bad. It's more realistic. In life, you often get locked out of some experience if you don't do a certain thing. I agree. Is it good or bad? I don't think it can be categorized easily as it's very subjective. I agree. I would agree with you. I think that it will be enjoyable in Colden Chronicles if we can handle it properly, but handling it properly is the battle, right? It's not difficult to get a bunch of writers and make NPCs. It's difficult to make it feel good, and for it to make sense narratively for whatever the player's chosen storyline is.
from a player's point of view, they will never see it. Well, guess what? Producers on your project are not going to like that. Publishers are going to hate it because you're going to have stuff and say, "Hey, I need to do voiceover for 12 companions, but depending on how the player plays, they're only going to see 4 or 5 of them." What?
Right?
Hey, I need to hire extra level designers to make all these maps and fill them up with encounters and loot and get them lit correctly and then test them to make sure that the things in that level work. Oh, some players won't see this. Actually, a lot of players won't. Maybe 80% of the players are never going to see this map. What?
Yeah.
This is just stuff that commonly gets thrown out, especially on modern games, because you're spending so much money that back when a game cost a couple million, going from 2 to 2.5 million didn't seem as bad to nowadays. If something costs 100 million and you need to make a game and a half, that's 150 million. You just asked for a lot of more money. And then your response is, "Oh yeah, and some people won't even ever see this. In fact, a majority of players won't ever see some of this content." Wow. Good luck getting that by your production staff, your director, if he's not convinced, he or she isn't convinced, and whoever's at your publisher who's signing these checks. They're not going to be happy.
That's why we make it a core pillar of our game, right? It's not like a tertiary feature of our game, and I think that in a lot of cases, games make this a tertiary feature. Like, oh, we have this really cool open world game that we're making, or like this RPG. A lot of times it's like an RPG game, right? Where, oh, we have all this cool, we have this combat and multiple cities that you can go to and towns. Oh, and also everything will react to choices. Like, no, if you have that, you need to make it a core part of your game because it will be a core part of where the budget goes. Tim's very right about that. And that's something that we knew too with Colden Chronicles. It's like, we're creating a lot of content that the player isn't going to see. We need to make sure that we budget for that. And yeah, it's going to add a lot of voiceover lines to it. And that's where a lot of our budget will go, is voiceover and writing. I feel like this is pointless unless your aim is replayability. I don't think so. I think reactivity is also a reason why you might have it, right? Where if you're making a role-playing game where you're part of the game's goal is to achieve reactivity and enable player choice that results in meaningful consequences, that you will have that. Does it also apply to replayability? Sure. But I think sometimes you can do it because you want more replayability and sometimes because you want that reactivity. At least for Colden Chronicles, I want it for reactivity, not for replayability. And I want to enable players to, if they want to replay it, they can and probably get different results. Or if they want to watch others play it, they can see how other people's stories unfold. Doing it the right way is the hard part, and of course it comes with what the game creator actually wants to convey on a message with this. Yeah, you're right. You're very right about that. It needs to be very well defined and then very well predicted, which is why, we need to make Spoon. I think my goal with first playable, I said, is 3 NPCs with some amount of overlap, but not too much overlap. Because 3 NPCs with overlap gives us the exact ideal view of how much this is going to cost with voice acting. and see exactly what we want to have for the final game. It's going to show us how much time we need to make 3, how much time the player takes to interact with all 3, and then how much it's going to cost to continue this forward, piece by piece for the rest of the vertical slice, and then for the rest of the game. And then we can scale down NPC in certain aspects of the world to fit the budget. Having an abundance of content is the holy grail of gaming, but obviously very expensive, yeah, and very difficult to organize. I see reactivity world impact makes sense. Yeah. But I agree that I think some developers do it just because of replayability, right? Actually, Baldur's Gate 3 they did this. They said, "Oh, the game has how many endings did they say it had? BG3 number of endings." Because this was bullshit. 17,000 endings. Sven completely rejected the idea that the ending comes down to a simple choice between two sides, siding with Orpheus or the Emperor in BG3. Yeah, but it does. It does, and it definitely did at launch because you didn't have any epilogue, so you didn't actually see what your choices really mattered. I don't think it's wrong to have 2 or 3 endings for a game. I think that sometimes players mistake that as, oh, the game doesn't react to your choices. No, it just means that it has small reactions, right? That with Colden Chronicles, we've openly said Colden Chronicles will probably have 2 to 3 endings for the corruption that we would like to have as a mechanic. But apart from that, the game isn't about curing or not curing the corruption. Or even if we don't have multiple major endings, it matters how you ended with NPCs, with these characters. That's the core focus. Like, did you help this NPC? Did you, stabilize this country? Did you send it into ruin? That's what matters. And I think we need to be very accurate when we start to market the game and talk about the game, that this is where the choices are made. I'm not going to count the number of endings because I think it's bullshit. We'll just say we don't know, and it's not about the number of endings, it's about the quality of the experiences that you have with those. So I hate this. I hate this bullshit about number of endings. I think that was a stupid thing to do by Larian Studios. It fucks with expectations. It doesn't make players any more understanding of what it means by an ending. It's absolutely, I hate that. Just pisses me off when the sword made out of swords in Elden Ring requires 36 strength and have to make a new character and only level strength to use it. That's fair. You can reset your stats. Can't do that until you're too far along in the game. You've already moved on and forgot about it. I mean, to some extent, you can rush Rolana and have her dead within an hour. And Rolana's really easy. Or is it Renala? It's Renala. It's Renala. Rolana's the one in the DLC.
Now, I said at the beginning that there is a solution to this, which some of you aren't going to like.
Okay.
But that solution is procedural generation. I talked about this in another video, but if you could procedurally generate encounters, like what's in the encounter, you could make them reactive to the player. The player has done a prison break by literally blowing a hole in the side of the prison. Now prisoners show up in your encounter lists. But
you can kind of handle that already with tags. I wouldn't consider that procedurally generated content as much as it is you're creating a system to react, right? Like a good example is Shadows of Doubt, right? That it procedurally generates murders and things for you to investigate, but that the system of obtaining information and framing people is set in stone, right? It's a created system. So the world doesn't actually have a crazy amount of reactivity or not believable reactivity. It's more, you can tell that it's a system. So there is procedurally generated content, but it is procedural remixing. I mean, that's not a terrible way to put it. But what he's saying, like if you I don't know, you something with a prison, right? More prisoners show up in your game. That's really just saying, okay, if this activity is triggered in the prison, then add this to the pool of monsters that can spawn or something. So it's not really procedural generation as much as it is you're just creating a system for reacting to the player's choices in the game. You're not creating scripted content, you're just creating systems for reaction.
Player has done something in the game that opened a gate to the netherworld. So now there's demons everywhere. You're going to have to make that content, and it's going to be dynamic based on what the player did. And then when he closes the gate, they should stop. So these are all encounters that you're going to need to have some of the time. Side dungeons could be like that. I love it when I'm playing a game and I explore and I find a dungeon or a cave or
Oblivion
something complex.
Like, right?
Now, I like to replay RPGs.
It's the same thing in my mind. I was like
it
when I thought gates, I'm like, oh, Oblivion gates. It's the exact same thing went on in my mind.
Those change. I like it too when, if they're procedurally generated, there's enough of them that if I encounter one that's locked and I don't have lockpick, I know that I can keep exploring somewhere else and I'll find something else I can do.
Yeah.
But if your side content is fixed, I feel really weird if I'm blocked out of something because I can't pick a lock. The same thing could be for random followers.
But the counterpoint to this, though, is that players know procedural generation. They know when they find a procedurally generated dungeon that what they're going into is random. And that has interesting things, right? That can be very fun because you know that you're going into something different each time. But on the flip side of that, I think that it also dies out pretty fast. That you know that you're going into a roguelike mode. And unless the roguelike modes, we'll just call it like that, like randomly generated dungeons, right? That you can kind of go into, they spawn around the world, like Power World, I guess is a good example to some extent, where they just appear around the world at different times, and they'll have different enemies and Pokemon in them, whatever. It's kind of cool, but unless the gameplay loop of that dungeoneering is enjoyable, it becomes really, really stale fast. It's like No Man's Sky. It's really cool until you realize that you go to 20 planets and everything is the same as the previous 20. You've seen it. It loses its purpose. Starfield is another example. It's really cool to go into those randomly generated and filled locations, like for the first couple times, and then it's like, well, okay, now there's no point to explore these because I've already been there. I already know what's there. And unfortunately, Starfield didn't do something which I hoped they did, or I'd hoped that they would do, which is Forever Sky is a game that I worked on did it, and that was also something that I saw in Payday, where they have the same levels, but they randomize elements that change the way that you approach it, right? So in some cases with Payday, you would have a jewelry store where a window in the back is open. And in other cases, you might have a crate, like a storage container, in front of that window. So now it's like, okay, now we need a different way in. So the same level that we have is now approachable from different, guys get the drill. Exactly, it's approachable from different angles, and it requires you to adapt to it. And Starfield, I think, could have made its procedural generation better by doing two things. Number one, more variety in dungeons that could actually spawn, right? Let's just call them dungeons or points of interest. And number two, randomizing elements within those so that even entering the same frozen, cryo lab was different each time, and it didn't. Warframe is enjoyable to an extent because it randomizes those rooms because it's modular. And, they hand create these rooms, so you're still getting a random layout of the dungeons, but you're getting handcrafted modules that are made from that. So there's a mixture between handcrafted and procedural, where if you go all handcrafted, it feels great, but there's not, it takes a lot of time to make. And if you go all procedural, nothing feels unique, and it's all just kind of bland and lifeless. So there is a mix between this that I think that it's done better in some games, done worse in other games, and some games you have that balance. So I agree that procedural generation can step in to assist, but it shouldn't be a replacement for fun. Procedural generation itself is a tool that you can use to create fun or to augment your pipeline, but it is never a replacement. It's never a selling point of what will make the game fun, if you ask me.
It'd be nice to be able
Card
to,
over here.
if you don't like the followers the game provides, if you could go to some, guild, a fighting guild, a mage guild, and say, what else you got? I kind of need somebody who's specialized in illusions. I kind of need a fighter that's got a couple thief classes and can backstab. If your game can generate random followers like that, you can eventually find someone who fits really well with what you want. A lot of games are like, nope, here are the 6 followers you get, but they're completely voice-overed. How great is that? For some people, that's wonderful. For other people, they're like,
what do you guys prefer? Because for me, I prefer the approach of having 6 or so named, voiced, unique characters with their own stories. I never get mercenaries in an RPG game like that, like a party-based RPG. I don't know what you guys prefer though, but for me, I vastly prefer the ones where I actually have stories. I can romance these characters. They have personalities. It's because it's content. It is. Procedural generation is complex enough it could theoretically mimic human level design. Theoretically. But not yet. Really in the future, a lot of things will be reactive and procedural. Ideally. And there's going to be... Do you guys remember the road between 2D and 3D games? And the types of games that came out early 3D? We're going to have that kind of feeling too. We're going to have that phase of game dev that we have to get through with the really, 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 really shitty implementation of that kind of generation. These are good ideas for the game I'm designing. Nice. Because it's content, I would rather voice acted characters if the stories are good. Yeah, me too personally. Never mercenaries, better alone than with some random generic character in the party. I agree too. I only ever use a custom main character for myself. Same. I'd love to see some polls of players and what they do. If they sometimes use mercenaries, never use mercenaries, or only use mercenaries, I guess. I'd love to see that because I can understand where if the procedurally generated characters were good enough, sure, it's great. But if the only instance is of, well, there's 6 named characters and none of them fit the role that I need in this party, well, you can solve that by like Divinity 2 had it, which was, or even Baldur's Gate 3, you could just re-roll the character. And some of their story may not make sense, but at least they'll fit within your party the way you want it to. I know for me, what I do when I get a new RPG game is I immediately research the classes of companions so that when I am playing either by myself or with my fiance, I can adapt to whatever our party is going to need. Because she likes to play mage a lot, and it's like, well, I don't care what I play, I can make anything work. But it's like, okay, then we're going to need a thief, we're going to need a warrior, and maybe some hybrid, maybe a cleric or whatever. So it's like, okay, we have a companion for A, we have a companion for B. I will then fit in this role. I don't mind what I play, I can play anything, as long as our party is well-rounded. Like the Nameless Curs, I get an XCOM Blood Bowl, and I turn them into hardened killers. Yeah, it works there in XCOM, doesn't it? 100%. Voice acting is expensive, and bad voice acting is worse than no voice acting, so it's really a matter of resources. I agree. You don't pay attention to something that isn't bad. You can accept that it isn't there. But if it's bad, you're only going to be focusing on how shitty it sounds.
6? All I get is 6. Rare loot can be the same way. I mean, I'm sure you all played games where the rare loot items are randomly generated, and that can be really exciting because it's like a slot machine. Every time you kill something, a powerful thing,
Gamba.
it may drop a rare loot, and it may have just those characteristics that your
usually
particular
doesn't.
player character wants in rare loot. That's exciting. We know that works. But the side effect of that is you have to have a really good loot system. I think
I wouldn't mind working on a. Sorry, Tim, for
Quest
pausing
can
you
be
on
generated.
that. But I wouldn't mind working on a loot system in a game that actively tailors the randomly generated loot to more likely fit the characters you have in your party and the builds you have. That's a very easy system to make, in my opinion, and one that I think could be a background aspect of an RPG game with looting that enhances the player experience. Tailored loot, yeah, yeah. It doesn't have to always be, but it has to. It just would feel a bit better if you can design your game around, oh, I have, four monks in my party or something. I'm doing some crazy weird build. And usually you'll get items that help those monks. Or, maybe it's an option. You can turn on weave just full random loot mode or tailored loot mode for a bit of a better experience. So that, oh, I haven't gotten an axe in a long time and I'm playing a character with an axe. We can just increase the chances for axe to drop, right? And we can read the player's skills and say, okay, let's up the percentage for the qualities on the effects of that rare axe to more likely target those abilities. It could be done, and it's very, very easy. Dragon's Dogma, for all its problems, did followers right, like with those personality presets and interactions. Yeah, it was pretty fun. It wasn't perfect, but I liked the direction that it goes in. Hey, Anomalies, how you doing? Level 3 100% does that, drops you shit for your friend. At least it always felt that way. Oh, like everything that drops is like, oh, this is good for your build, but God forbid we get a bow and arrow for me. Really was a good compromise between voiced custom followers. Yeah, and it felt fun.
Generated. Once you
I love. By the way, I love building systems like that where they work in the background for the player and create a better player experience, but the player may not always even know that they're there, right? I think I did some of that for the train game, but I forget what exactly would have done that. I love background systems though. You'll never know that it exists, or you may not know that it exists, but it's helping you little by little. Play a character with axe and you like to do, I don't know, bleed based skills. Okay, you're gonna find axes just a little bit more often, and bleed qualities on your loot might be a little bit better or a little bit more prevalent.
once you know that like side dungeons can be generated and encounters can be generated and loot can be generated, it's a tiny step farther to just go quests can be generated. You can spin up a dungeon with some random encounters and a rare loot at the bottom, and then boom, now an NPC in one of your towns
Okay,
says, "Hey, my grandfather had this treasure map," or "My mom disappeared, but now I heard a rumor that she was, seen going into this dungeon, and now you explore it, and maybe."
this exists in modding form with pretty much every Bethesda game, right? I don't know if you guys have played modded Bethesda, but you can get the missives mod for it. Maybe I'll pull it up. Skyrim missives. You can go up to the missive board in towns. Maybe I can find a photo of that. Right here. And you can collect these randomly generated missives that you can then turn in and obtain rewards. I don't ever use these. I don't know about other people. It's a very, very popular mod. 2.5 million total downloads. It's got a lot of endorsements. I just don't do them because Skyrim, number one, already has a ton of quests in the game. You play for a few hours and your quest log is like massive. I just don't feel like I want to do them. Gives me PTSD from New World mission boards. Yeah, it's like I don't know if do I want randomly generated quests? Maybe after the game is completed and if I want to still keep playing it. But they lack soul because usually they can only randomly generate so far as to do, well, go kill this troll in this dungeon, right, and come back to me. It's like, okay. For what, 100 coins? And nothing else changes in the world? I don't know. For me, it just doesn't mean anything special. but maybe that's just me. That's just my feeling that I don't do missives. I still get the mod, it still exists, and then I never play with it. So I don't know.
Maybe you can find her and she's randomly generated. Maybe you can find the heirloom brooch, is what the NPC really wanted.
Yeah.
It's randomly generated. That can be super, super fun. It can also make.
For like 2 times that you do it, and then you realize that it has no impact on the world. It doesn't have its own custom writing. It's not voice acted, or even worse, it has AI voice, acting, which is just really, really stiff, and you can tell.
Make your
I don't
game
know if I
world
want that.
bigger. It can make your game world feel way more reactive to the type of player you're making. Because if you hear about a dungeon that's going to require a lot of fighting, and then there's another quest that's like you can sneak in the back, pick a lock, disarm some traps, and get in, that may be way more suited for the kind of character you're playing. Now, I already know that some people don't like this. Some people don't like procedural generation. Some of you don't like it. I get it. Some of you think it feels sterile. It feels repetitive.
Yeah.
Some developers don't like it for the same reasons. And also, it's a little threatening job-wise. But
It
I
is.
think if procedural generation is done carefully, like we did procedural dialogue in Arcanum, then I think the subsequent content that it opens up as a reward for the kind of character you're playing and the choices you're making can be really, really cool. I don't see this as much. It's a lot harder to procedurally generate things, good things. It's easy to procedurally generate things. It's hard to procedurally generate good stuff.
Very, very correct.
It's way easier just to handcraft it and go, we have a linear story now. We have a linear main story arc, a couple side quests you can do, a slight amount of reactivity, boom, ship it. But I believe if people did things more this way, you'd get a lot more interesting reactive games. So I hope, Ulysses Sampaio, this answered your question, and I'm hoping some of you may have changed your mind a little bit about how cool a procedurally generated game could be.
I think for me, it just comes down to expectation and execution, like everything else, right? Like, I'm not going to sit here and say procedural generation is bad or it's good. It's simply, yeah, if you execute it well and you let players know that this is where and how it works, and if people want to buy it, then they know, right? So it's like the customer is always right in this case, and if customers go into a game knowing that there's procedural generation, like with Shadows of Doubt or No Man's Sky, and they're okay with it as it's implemented and executed, then what's the problem, right? But if I go into a game expecting handcrafted and I get procedurally generated, I'm going to feel like either I wasn't informed properly, or maybe they mismarketed, or maybe I just didn't read enough. Any of those could be the problem. So I don't know. It's a case of sure. It's all just a matter of how you do it and how you show it to players. I suppose, yeah, if the procedural generation was so good and so minute based on the player's actions within the game, right? Like an intelligent AI, an intelligent kind of game master behind the scenes doing calculations and figuring out what to spawn for the player, then yeah, it could work. But at that point, then that's what the game is like about. That's what you're spending most of your time and resources trying to achieve, is good procedural generation. In which case, again, if it's shown to the player like that, then I don't see any reason why it couldn't get really good reviews for your game and go down well with players. But if you just kind of shove it in there, as in, well, even people have said, are you going to procedurally generate the ingredients in Colden Chronicles? Are you going to procedurally generate the dungeons? It's like, no, I want to handcraft them. I understand that it's going to affect some things, but I'd like to make sure that this game is learnable. It's documentable by the community, that when they say, here's the puzzle and here's how you solve it, or here's where you can find a collection of rare ingredients hidden behind a waterfall, that other players who may be stuck or may need some help, because it's a casual game, right? It's meant for casual to mid-core audience, that they can engage in that and get a little bit of help from the community, and they don't have to say, well, it spawns in one of 10 locations depending on the procedural generation, so check all 10 locations until you find it. Okay, well, I don't know. For some players that might be fun, for some it might not be. content as reward. Great video as always from Tim Cain. There's a link if you guys wanted to watch it yourself or give him a subscription and thumbs up. And thank you, YouTube, for watching that one. We're going to move on to another one because we still have time. A lot of time today. Bye-bye, YouTube.